Hello, everyone. I am Jonathan. I'm going to read a section of Ethics, the Fundamentals by Julia Driver. Not sure what to expect, but let's just dive into it. I'm going to skip the introduction just because I don't know why. I already know what I'm going to get into. Chapter 1. The Challenge to Moral Universalism. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all the other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Frederick Douglass, July 5th, 1852. We are very familiar with the practice of moral appraisal. Whenever we assess an action or policy as right or wrong, or a person as good or bad, we are evaluating. There are whole ranges of behaviors that people tend to view as wrong: killing innocent persons, theft, lying, or cheating. For example, others we typically evaluate as right or good: charity, promise-keeping, and respect for others. For example, it would be very difficult to imagine living as we do with this practice of evaluation and moral appraisal. We need to evaluate potential courses of action in order to decide what to do. We need to evaluate in order to convey our moral concern to others. Positive social change also requires evaluation. For example, when Frederick Douglass, the great American orator and reformer, condemned the institution of slavery, he was evaluating the institution, judging it to be wrong and a social evil. Yet, in spite of its seemingly significance, there are some people who are very skeptical about morality, about whether there is such a thing. Footnote. In reality, this chapter focuses on a particular type of argument for moral relativism, one based on a consideration of cultural differences. As a truly universal moral system, and whether any moral claims are true or just a matter of opinion, some argue that what is morally good is a matter of taste or a matter of convention. So moral judgments are like aesthetic ones, where just about anything goes. We can trace such a view back to historian Herodotus, who noted that there were enormous cultural diversity on moral issues. In some countries, cannibalism is permissible, and in others is immoral. In some nations it is acceptable to eat beef, while in others it is not. Who's to say what is really right or wrong? There is no universal fact of the matter about rightness and wrongness and so forth. On this view of moral evaluation, normative claims will be radically different from the descriptive claims. For example, if someone were to make the descriptive claim, wombats are mammals, she would be stating something that has a truth value that does not vary across individual beliefs or across cultures. If one is true, it is true not in the virtue of what someone happens to believe. The truth value of one is not a relative matter. How do we find out whether or not it is true or false? We look at the features of wombats relevant to their classification as mammals. Are they warm-blooded and furry, and do they give birth to live young? The answers to all these questions are affirmative, so one is true. In determining the truth value of one, we don't look at what people happen to believe about wombats. After all, people can be mistaken. Moral relatives hold the normative claims such as moral ones, however, are quite different from the descriptive claims such as one, and do have truth values that can vary. The most prevalent forms hold that the truth values depend upon the people happen to believe to be right or wrong, or good or bad. These sorts of views pose challenges to normative ethics in the sense that they challenge its status, and authority. It's worth discussing the most significant challenge, that of cultural moral relativism, before turning to specific normative theories. First, though, we will look at a similar, though more restrictive view, that of individual moral relativism. One form of moral relativism is a very restrictive, holding that the truth value of moral claims can vary from individual to individual. This view is sometimes referred to as simple subjectivism. Consider the claim. 2. Abortion is always wrong. There are some people who believe that 2 is true and others who believe that 2 is false. If you think that the correct way to relativize moral truth is to the beliefs and attitudes of individuals, then we need to hold that 2 is true for those who believe it, but false for who believe it false. Then 2 is both true and false, but false for one person is true for another. One way to spell out this theory more plausibly is to hold the claims such as 2 are just reports of approval and disapproval, so that when Mary utters 2 sincerely, that is just the same as saying something like, I, Mary, disapprove of abortion. 3. If Mary is being sincere, then 3 must be true. If 3 is the same as 2, then 2 must also be true. But note that if Ralph says, 4. Abortion is always permissible, which is the same on this theory as 5. I, Ralph, do not disapprove of abortion. Then if Ralph sincerely utters 4, 4 must be true as well. Thus 2 and 4 are both true, albeit relativized to different subjects. Footnote. Subjectivism can be spelled out in a wide variety of ways. This is just one. For example, some subjectivists discussed in a later chapter hold that moral utterances have no truth value at all, since they are just expressions of an individual's emotional response to an action. This version is sometimes called meta-ethical subjectivism. For more on this distinction, you can look at Russ Schaeffer's Landau's Ethical Subjectivism and Reason and Responsibility, reading Some Basic Problems of Philosophy, edited by Joel Feinberg and Ross Schaeffer Landau. But in this chapter, we will discuss the variety that is more naturally contrasted with cultural moral relativism. The very odd result that when Ralph and Mary argue about abortion, there is really nothing that they are disagreeing about. How can Mary disagree with Ralph? Really, when all he is actually saying is that he does not disapprove of abortion. But this goes against our views about what takes place in moral argumentation. We do believe that something more substantive or objective is at stake. Subjectivism, it seems to be attractive view to some because it seems highly tolerant. What is right for me may not be right for you. Since you have different beliefs, we sometimes hear people talking as though, for example, abortion is right for some, but for me would be murder. But upon reflection, most people find the view that right is purely a matter of opinion to lack plausibility. It seems quite counterintuitive, since it would result in the truth, albeit subjective truth, of claims such as, for me, mass killing is perfectly permissible, as long as the person making the utterance actually believed that mass killings were permissible. But a genocidal maniac cannot be acting rightly just because he happens to believe that he is acting rightly. There are lots of cases to which we could refer to show how unappealing such a criterion of rightness would be. There have been many people who have done terrible things and yet have felt very self-righteous about their actions. The Nazi commander Heinrich Himmler, for example, believed that morality demanded that he obey his leader for the sake of German society. Of course, he was horribly wrong about this. His individual beliefs in no way provided justification for what he did and the horrors that he inflicted on others. I like to stop there to talk for a little bit, just because I found it quite odd. If we, based on, I guess this is where she's kind of saying that moral subjectivism is wrong. I was going to say, well, in his day, the best thing was to, be a patriot for Germany and, commit the horrors that he did out of obedience to Germany. And I like how it says that he obeyed his leader for the sake of German society. If that was truly his, moral subjectivism, then yeah, I don't think he did anything wrong. But, there is such thing as objective moralism, that what he did was actually wrong, or at least we tried to find out in what ways that was actually wrong. So say like him doing that actually in the end for some reason was great for humanity, then it would still be wrong. It's really nice arguing about these things, and I'm kind of glad I'm reading this book. Let's go on though. So mere individual belief about what is right and what is wrong cannot morally justify someone's actions in doing anything. Whether is right or wrong, a person is not acting rightly or wrongly just because she happens to believe that she is doing is right or wrong. There must be something else that justifies her action or not. Some moral reasons for or against the action. So most people who find moral relativism attractive do not find subjectivism attractive. Instead, the alternate formulation, which involves appealing to cultural relativism, seems to be favored. The rightness of an action is determined by what people in a given culture by and large believe. Thus, many relatives will argue that instead of relativizing to individual beliefs, we relativize to cultural beliefs. It is those beliefs that determine the true value of the moral judgment or claim. So when someone makes a claim, for example, stealing is wrong, whether or not this is true depends on what the people believe about stealing culture of the person who makes the claim. The major consideration in favor of this theory is that it seems to reflect actual moral practice. That cultural differences in moral beliefs and attitudes exist is a certainty. Burial practices vary from culture to culture. Female circumcision is practiced in some cultures, condemned in others. Certain animals are approved eating in one culture, but not another. And the list would go on. These differences exist across time as well as geography. There is huge temporal variation in cultural beliefs about moral issues. For example, in the United States over 200 years ago, the vote for a woman was, by most, considered ridiculous. In fact, when Abigail Adams wrote her husband John, who would later become the second president of the United States, and broached the subject of extending further rights to women, this was his response: "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere. The children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent. The Indians slighted their guardians, and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest were grown discontented. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." What? Yo, this is crazy. John Adams straight up. Wow. Okay, he just straight up Well, I don't think he was sexist. I think he just didn't want, women to be out of place. Basically put Abigail on her place with this letter that he wrote. He goes on to argue, jokingly, that otherwise men would be entirely subject to the despotism of the petticoat. Well, things have changed a bit since 1776. There is a difference between how people in the USA feel about equality and the scope of equality today as opposed to 250 years ago. What significance do these observations of cultural variation, moral belief have for moral theory? Some writers, particularly anthropologists such as Ruth Benedict, believe that this fact establishes the truth of moral relativism. This view is very attractive to many people because it is viewed as tolerant as moral diversity. Interesting. We do not any longer make the mistake of deriving the morality of our locality and decade directly from the inevitable constitution of human nature. We do not elevate it to the dignity of the first principle. We recognize that morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Most cultures distinguish between morality and good manners, so this quote doesn't seem quite right to me. Everyone thinks of morality as something more than just socially approved habits. However, this quote from Benedict does, I think, capture the spirit of moral relativism, which is based on recognition of cultural diversity. There is no right or wrong that transcends a given culture, no universal truth to morality. It is important to note that relativism is a radically strong claim. It is not to be confused with the view that rightness is somehow context sensitive. There is a fair, controversial view, instead of relativism, maintains that there are no universal moral truths at all, where universal is understood as across all cultures, precisely because moral quality is understood relative to beliefs of persons in a given society. A person who believes that the claim is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering was universally true and thus disagree with relativism would be free to concede that what counts as unnecessary suffering may vary from context to context, depending on the facts of the situation. So, for example, it might be wrong for AI to buy a carpet in a situation in which that carpet was made using child labor and unjust labor practices. But it would not be wrong for the Stephanie to buy a carpet given that it was made without harming anyone. Thus it is true to say that whether or not it is acceptable to buy a carpet depends upon the circumstances, but not in any way that undercuts moral universalism. This is because the rationale for whether or not it is acceptable does not itself vary from context to context. Again, the universalist can claim that the relevant basic moral truth is that it is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, and this holds in both of the cases mentioned above. Relativism denies that claims such as this have any universal or objective standing. Instead, if we believe the cultural differences argument, we believe that truth of a moral claim depends completely on the beliefs that are common to the culture to which the judgment is made. And we have noted those beliefs and practices can vary dramatically across cultures. Well, I guess that kind of puts a nail in my theory of there has to be some universalist morality on what is right or wrong. Because I guess there's too many contexts. Let's continue, see what she's trying to say. The position that is generally contrasted with moral relativism is moral universalism. This is a view that at least some basic moral norms and values are universal basic moral value. Basic moral value refers to a value that explains other norms. For example, in one society, people may judge child labor to be immoral, thus they condemn this sort of behavior. This is explained by appeal to a more basic norm or value, such as causing unnecessary pain is bad. The moral universalist believes that there are derivative norms that may differ across cultures, but at least some basic norms don't. One candidate for a universal norm would be something like causing unnecessary pain is bad. It may be that the cultures differ in their derivative prescriptions. In one culture, child labor is permissible and in another is not. This will be explained by saying that either one culture is just mistaken about the permissibility of child labor, or two, the different cultures are faced with different circumstances, and in one culture child labor is unnecessary to family survival, whereas in another one, for example, without public education and social safety net, it is necessary for family survival. Okay. The denial of universalism has been a popular view. Part of this appeal is due to the fact there is something that in order to be tolerant of others, we need to reject universalism with respect to truth and morality, and instead ascribe to relativism. Moral relativism does not deny that moral claims are true or false, only that their true value is relative. Thus, though we may disagree with that what people believe about torture in one culture, say the United States or CIA, I ad-lib that part, we always adopt a tolerant attitude by holding as relativism would seem to demand that torture is not okay by me, but is okay for them. Yeah. And tolerance is a moral virtue. There is no objective truth to appeal to, and criticism of various cultural practices seem unjustified. What we call morality is just a construct of various societies and cultures, each with its own set of norms and not subject to criticism or praise from outsiders. Of course, we are free to ask whether or not tolerance is universally a virtue. If so, relativism is false. If not, then what about cultures that reject tolerance themselves? Relativism also seems to offer a principled way of approaching moral disagreement, at least at the cultural level. If someone wants to know, next page, whether or not stealing is wrong, he just has to determine what the prevailing beliefs are in a given culture. However, this really just seems to favor a moral conformity. Moral progress is often achieved through the efforts of rebellious individuals with beliefs that do not conform to popular cultural beliefs. It seems odd to say that they were wrong and that everyone else was right, until others just happen to start sharing their beliefs. But relativism also has some very serious disadvantages. Tolerance of the behaviors of others only goes so far, as long as there is a view that rights and moral rights are being violated. Most people will not think tolerance in that context a virtue. This indicates that there is some universality to morality in that oppression is wrong no matter what the prevalent cultural beliefs happen to be. Jeffrey Stout puts the problem for relativism, or actually anti-realism, this way. I deny the wrongness of torturing innocents is simply a belief that we have that is justified by some expedient social convention. Knowingly and willingly torturing innocents is wrong, impermissible, and unjust. It always has been. There is the moral truth of the matter, whether we recognize it or not. A truth I deem more certain than any explanation I could give it or any argument I could make it on its behalf. Another example that illustrates this point is female circumcision. This is a practice some cultures of excising a portion of blank. It is usually practiced on young girls. It is quite painful and can lead to numerous health problems for the girls. I actually wrote a paper on this in college. But it is practiced for cultural reasons, and some argue as a way of depriving females of sexual enjoyment. Of course, in Western culture, such a practice is considered quite immoral. So here we have a case of cultural moral disagreement. Moral relativism will hold that in Western cultures, female circumcision is wrong, is true, whereas in cultures where people don't happen to hold similar beliefs, that claim would be false, and it may well be true instead that female circumcision is right. But someone might argue that, of course, it is perfectly clear that there is no universality after all. We have the empirical evidence of moral disagreement. So doesn't this show that universality doesn't exist? No, it does not. And as philosophers such as James Rachels have noted, there are 3 reasons why. Cultural differences are not evidence to the view that there is no universal truth to morality. There will be such a non-relative truth, but people are mistaken about it or unaware of it. Just as it is true that the Earth orbits around the Sun, even 500 years ago, when few people, if anyone, believed it. The premise that there is a diversity of belief cannot support a conclusion that there is no universal truth to morality. Some people, or everybody, even might be mistaken. Further, when philosophers claim that morality is universal, they are making a normative or prescriptive claim to the effect that people ought to abide by these norms, rather than a descriptive claim that they do in fact abide by these norms. The claim that there are universal moral norms is a claim that there are norms that have authority over the actions of people universally. It does not mean that there are moral norms that have been accepted universally. Only the latter claim is impacted by empirical evidence that different norms seem to be accepted by different cultures. The latter claim may be false given our empirical evidence, but the empirical evidence does not affect the truth or falsity of the first claim. As many other philosophers have noted, we cannot derive something like there is no universal moral truth from such a claim as different cultures have different moral codes. The second is simply a descriptive claim, whereas the first is interpreted as having normative significance, and what people ought to do and what they believe about what they ought to do are very different. People can be morally mistaken. Even descriptively, it is not at all conclusive that values differ. It could simply be that circumstances differ, or the non-moral beliefs that affect moral practices that differ. That's pretty interesting, actually. So it does not follow from variation in practices that we have even descriptive variation in values. Same values may be accepted, but differing circumstances or beliefs result in different practices. Rachels very clearly explores the same issues are raised here. It does not follow from variation in moral practices that no objective standard of morality exists. I think we're almost done with the chapter, and I think I'll end it there. Further, we intuitively like to think that within cultures we can observe moral progress. That is, things seem to be getting better in some cultures at least. For example, some take the facts that slavery is illegal, and that women now have the right to vote as a sign of moral progress in USA. Recall Frederick Douglass in his condemnation of slavery. That slavery is a moral evil is compelling reason to abolish it. The abolition of slavery throughout the U.S. This change in the culture of the U.S. denotes genuine moral progress and not simply a shift in what people happen to believe. Recall about the interchange between Abigail and John Adams. The view that John Adams espoused, which would likely have been typical within the culture at the time, is no longer viewed as legitimate. Restricting rights on basis that we now view to be arbitrary is unjust, and it was unjust at that time. Thus, it does not seem plausible to maintain that there has been moral progress since 1776, at least with respect to some issues. Okay, I guess too. However, this would have to be rejected as illusory if moral relativism is true, since there would be no objective standard along to measure progress. I like that. I love that she's saying that. Otherwise, like, we're just going to be progressing to, I guess, weird ways that we think are right, but ain't, Yeah. Instead, there will be changed, but we wouldn't be justified in claiming one sort of change to be better than another, or worse either for that matter. None of the above considerations provide a knockdown argument against relativism, since the relativists could simply bite the bullet and accept that all those unpalatable intuitions. The point of above criticism is to note that many people find themselves attracted to relativism because they mistakenly identify it with tolerance, or think that such relativism is necessary to adopt an attitude of tolerance toward differing social customs and conventions. Closer reflection reveals that, instead, the view that implications are quite unattractive and implications that most persons will be unwillingly to accept. While tolerance is valuable, it only goes far. It clearly can't cover outrageous moral problems, but we've seen in play throughout human history. Of course, this is not to deny that tolerance is a good thing in the right circumstances. Tolerance is a good thing as long as we're not talking about practices with moral import. The feeling that relativism is supported by the value of tolerance can be explained away in the following way, by noting a distinction between moralizing. Sometimes people illegitimate moralize non-moral norms. They try to turn a non-moral issue into a moral one by projecting emotional responses of various sorts. So someone might view a deviation from norms of taste as a moral deviation. How dare he wear a robe instead of trousers? Or a deviation from norms of etiquette as a moral deviation. How dare she use the entree fork for her salad? This is a natural human tendency that needs to be guarded against. Some things, even things that people feel very strongly about, such as manners and fashion, are not moral. They may be aesthetic, in which case these norms lack the authority of moral norms. Constance may experience deep revulsion whenever she sees someone mixing chartreuse fabric with a plaid. I guess she's talking about fashion. She may form the judgment one ought not to mix a chartreuse fabric with plaid. But this use of ought, though normative, is not moral. The person who is mixing clashing fabrics is not harming anyone. Of course, if Sandra wears a chartreuse and plaid for the purpose of making Constance feel bad, that is a different issue. But what makes her action bad is the fact that she's trying to make Constance queasy, not that she's mixing fabrics in an aesthetically inappropriate way. Whether or not someone wears a robe instead of trousers is not a moral issue. Yet throughout history, people have mistakenly turned such issues into moral issues, labeling, for example, non-Western clothing as indecent, when in fact it was perfectly suited to non-Western climates. Sort of moralizing, I believe, is what makes many people attracted to relativism. However, universalism does not condone moralizing and is perfectly compatible with tolerance of cultural variation that does not violate universal moral norms. So, for example, it is compatible with condemning female circumcision, while being neutral on the issue of alternate forms of clothing and self-adornment. In this chapter, we discuss a major challenge to ethics. I hope to have shown that this challenge, while initially appealing, is untenable. Still, if there is a universal true content to morality, what is it? Various writers have often offered accounts of morality by citing different fundamental norms and values. We will spend most of this remainder of the book criticizing and examining these alternates. That's kind of cool. So that was that. Looks like Pinocchio is just stuck in Hotel Krat for that last part. But I hope you guys enjoyed that. Hope I didn't wear down my voice, and I hope you guys can hear me. If not, just let me know in the comments. See you guys next time.